I'm super excited to be here. I got my partner on the line. My name is Dave-Inder Comar. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Hey.
The theme of this podcast, and hopefully what the several episodes will make, relate to this idea of purpose-driven organizations, which is becoming an increasing specialty of our practice and something we're also proud to be. We're also very proud to have built a purpose-driven law firm. And we're going to be making a number of episodes about what purpose-driven organizations are and how they can succeed in a marketplace in which we need more organizations to think about their internal impact as well as their external impact. Our intention with this series is to spread the word about purpose-driven organizations and the problems that they're capable of solving, and to encourage people, whether you're starting out for the first time with an organization or whether you are part of a governance structure of an ongoing organization, to consider how incorporating purpose into your organization can really benefit not only your organization, but benefit the wider world.
Talking about the organization's purpose until very recently had been like one of those things, like men don't talk about their feelings. You're supposed to kind of either understand the purpose or treat it with a degree of what I think of as kind of a Gen X cynicism, which is, oh, sure, the company, they may have some values on the website and someone might unintentionally click over to those values while trying to find the product or service they want. But the people in the organization aren't really living that purpose day to day. And having worked for so long in an established corporate environment that has that approach to purpose and values, the discovery of purpose-driven organizations, the idea that you can go to work and relish what you stand for and really live that truth and get excited about what are we going to accomplish today because your drive is reflected in the organization's mission. That was a watershed moment where I thought, is it possible to create an organization that actually reflects your own purpose and your own goal?
Aligning what you do in the day-to-day with deeper aspirations and building a team around that too, like building a team of people who are meeting professional, personal needs through the organization while the organization is accomplishing what it's setting out to do.
One of the things that we like to think about is when you have a purpose-driven organization, you no longer need to pitch because you're not trying to convince someone to do anything. You're just trying to calibrate transparently whether your purpose aligns with their purpose.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
And if there's things that arise as conflicts, often those are just a question of sort of recalibrating and understanding. So it really echoes a lot of them, including nonviolent communication, including positive psychology.
And for me too, it's also a way of bridging corporations and corporate purpose to larger planetary challenges, right? Which I think are becoming impossible to ignore for any company, honestly. And I think companies that now ignore those challenges do so at their peril, both financial peril and also with respect to their cultural peril.
That's a point that resonates personally, profoundly nowadays, because I think there was this deal, maybe a little bit of a devil's bargain, depending on how you characterize it, but that you would opt for doing whatever it was for the sake of an apprenticeship where, okay, no, I'm learning the trade. And I think what's really changed profoundly with the new generation, Gen Z, is that they want to start living their purpose from day one, where they say they don't want to compromise in order to learn a skill that's going to be valuable later on, where they can deploy it, which I think in some respects was the vision of earlier generations. I'll learn how to make the machine, and then I will make a machine that will benefit humanity. And nowadays, I don't want to be working for a machine that's harming.
And I think that perspective is absolutely needed even for later stage professionals. I hope that's maybe some of the things we're going to talk about today might also inspire later stage or later career professionals to consider how they're thinking about their own careers, especially if they have some level of mastery. And living in a time of relative abundance in the US, but also in a time of grave crisis, right? So with respect to how should we be using and deploying the skills that we have, given the challenges that are right in front of us and that business can contribute to in terms of solutions. So how are we defining purpose-driven organizations, and why are they different than just your day-to-day or standard corporation?
It's a great question because language is so important in this domain, and at the same time, it's so elusive. Purpose-driven organizations, we like to think of it as the successor to the clear bifurcation between for-profit and non-profit.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. It's like an evolution in market practice. Instead of deciding to say, let's set up a for-profit or a non-profit, it's about determining what are we going to do together collectively, bring the right corporate structure that works for that, or a hybrid structure, and then implementing that and tethering that to the goal of the entity. It represents an evolution, I think, in the thinking of how many business lawyers or nonprofit lawyers might be thinking today with respect to missions more generally. I mean, it's funny when you incorporate a Delaware C Corp, for example, there's always that standard language that this organization can conduct any lawful business under the laws of the state of Delaware. There's like a sentence saying that the company can basically do whatever it wants as long as it's not illegal under the laws of Delaware. And that is a striking reminder about how much freedom of operation there is for corporate entities in the U.S., right? And that's a good thing in exploration or experimentation. But from a business perspective, I think it can lead lack of focus. It can lead to negative externalities. It can lead to lack of being able to encourage retention with employees and other service providers who believe in what the organization is doing. When this organization has completed its purpose, what does the world look like when this organization is successful? And these questions are not really ever asked. And I think it's time to ask those questions.
A purpose-driven organization is one that defines its people, its path, and its purpose in a way that gives you more of a concrete sense of where you're going, how you're getting there. And I'm glad you brought up the corporate charter, because the corporate purpose clause used to serve a function.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even back to the origin of limited liability with some of the East India companies, and the idea of giving a public charter and creating an entity that has a degree of personhood, so that the liability buck stops with the entity and doesn't go down into the shareholders of the entity. It was originally conceived of as a sort of social contract, a contract of sorts with the public that says, what this organization is doing is so important that we want to incentivize the people who are investing their time and their money. And in order to do that, we're going to give them the ability to limit their liability. And we're going to say that the organization exists as a person, but the reason why we're making that deal is because it has this purpose.
Right. If you're a company, first of all, how do you determine if you are, in fact, a purpose-driven organization? And if you make the determination that you're not, how do you become one? I think it's more of a business and organizational function, which is to say, having the board or management really analyze what it is we're doing, asking the why, how, and the where questions. My guess is that most successful businesses or nonprofits probably have the why well defined. In fact, that's probably a key metric to organizational success, but the how and the where may not be as well defined. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different framework in mind?
I think about it as an organizational exercise in introspection,
Mm-hmm.
where we really have to think through not just the big picture headings of what words or what values you stand for, but also what's the destination, which gets into the where, the telos, right, in the Greek philosophical sense. That task is really about coming up with a list of commandments, principles, precepts, but the function is a roadmap and a clear definition of the path that you're going to take to get to your destination, and how there are certain things you won't do. There are certain places you won't go. So I think there are a lot of positive principles that could be put in place, but there are also negative aspects where, okay, this is something we won't do.
Right.
And I think that defines the channel of your path. The final task is a communicative one, which is, we may know what this destination is, but is this something that someone can read and get a concrete image of where we're going as an organization, and that it can line up with their own personal purpose?
I think about this in very similar terms, which is to say, I think a purpose-driven organization is an organization that has a picture or has a sense of what the world will look like if and when they're successful, and is also communicating that vision of success publicly, right? I think the classic tech startup framework is, let's solve a problem, right? And then once we've solved this problem, we've solved it, right? And we're making a bunch of money, right? So you can talk about this in a variety of different market spaces, but there isn't any real thought with a lot of companies, not every company, but certainly with a lot of them, as to what the world has looked like. How has it changed for the better or for the worse? Sometimes for the worse, a lot of times for the worse, when this process is completed and when the problem has been solved from the organization's perspective. I think the models of the last 2 decades, or in particular the last decade, have fractured a lot of us. It's move fast and break things, right? That's the motto, is to move fast and break things for many tech companies. And then but once something is broken, like who's in charge of cleaning that up, right? What if you're breaking all the wrong stuff? What if you're breaking things in such a terrible way or in such a destructive way that we have a broken society as a result, right? It's not a hidden directive, right? Like maybe Humpty Dumpty was better put together 10 years ago where we could withstand some of that. But now, Humpty Dumpty's broke, right? So, and there really isn't any accountability, and there may never be any accountability as to how we got here. But I think in terms of where we proceed and where we move forward, I think people, whether it's investors, whether it's donors, whether it's founders of companies, should consider, in my view, the purpose-driven approach as opposed to the move fast and break things approach.
To some extent, the purpose has been thought of as a future problem on day one. Okay, let's get some users, let's get some traction, let's figure out what people actually want. And then we'll think about, our larger purpose. And the purpose-driven organization flips that. So it says, we have to think about that on day one. It may be inconvenient at times. It may be challenging and difficult because you have to make some hard choices that may not necessarily reflect what people want at this very moment. So you may be slightly less responsive to user demands because you're living and conducting a business that's based on this purposeful drive.
How should organizations commence this process of incorporating purpose into their charter, into their missions?
Well, I think our process has always been to treat an organization like a person. I think the corporate personhood doctrine, it gets some rightful criticism when it's used to sort of shield people from the externalities which we've been discussing.
Definitely.
But it is a helpful analogy when you think through corporate introspection. So I think it's one of those moments where you sit down and you just sort of think through the creative components and the objective components, where there's an element of creative introspection where your hopes, your dreams, your wishes, your ultimate objectives, like what is the organization's ultimate sort of hopes, dreams, wishes. Early days, it's very easy as a reflection of the founder's own ethos. It gets a little bit more complicated when it's a collective, but it's still possible to think about the organization as a person and having its own hopes, dreams, wishes, objectives. And then on the other side, the finding your purpose equation is the objective components, where what are our superpowers? What are our strengths? What do we do so much better? And oftentimes, I think the most effective way of finding a compelling purpose is to see that point of intersection where, okay, this is our hope and our dream for the future. And coincidentally, we have this superpower where we're so much better at doing this than other people. So now we're going to chart a course to get to this destination using some of our existing strengths and building upon them in order to create this map, to create these sequence of sort of stepping stones. So it becomes a strategic vision. And I think the ultimate kind of litmus test is, does it feel authentic? Does it feel true?
I think authenticity is a huge part of this, right? I think a genuine corporate purpose or organizational purpose is going to be authentic. It will be authentic at every element of the organization, whether it's the way that customers or users or consumers or the public. At every stage of how the public interacts with this organization, it's going to feel authentic. It's going to feel authentic internally at the board level. It's going to feel authentic with the way that service providers and employees interact. Authenticity is a key value and objective. Organizations attempting to be purpose-driven organizations oftentimes get called out when their labor practices are exposed and they end up having terrible labor practices, or there's a culture of discrimination at the company, right? And that really resonates with a lot of people because you understand that type of inauthenticity is a terrible thing.
I'm glad you brought that up because it is a felt thing.
Yeah.
There is a level of vibe, and it gets more complicated when you have a dense and complicated organizational history with various phases of what the organization has been through. In order to establish that level of authenticity, sometimes it's necessary to reconcile with your past and to determine, hold on, to not just simply sort of say, turn the page by turning the page, but to go back into some of those prior, more difficult chapters to read and say, how have we been involved in a process that kind of taints our present moment because it's part of our current energy.
100%.
And to authentically address that by means of some form of truthful reconciliation with the past is, I think a really important, difficult, and challenging task for existing organizations that do have those chapters And I think what we see sometimes is when it feels most inauthentic when there are organizations that just try and create this tabula rasa. Okay, we're just going to hit reset.
Right.
And now there's nothing. And then energy is still felt by people who are experiencing their new messaging. So it's not like you could just etch a sketch that away by just shaking up the board.
100%. And it absolutely does feel inauthentic, particularly if the practices never change. Part of this process for an established organization that's been around for years or decades, part of this process of becoming purpose-driven would involve cleaning out the attic, so to speak, and making amends where appropriate, making reparations where appropriate for previous corporate conduct. Where should an organization define its purpose? Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where does a organization start to define and implement its purpose?
I think that there's a spectrum between the aspirational side of the spectrum and then the contractually binding side of the spectrum.
Right. Or corporate law binding. Yeah, 100%.
Exactly, corporate law binding. And there's a parallel spectrum that's related between this sort of vague and the concrete. So, see this in the context of various climate pledges. How concrete are you?
Right. That's right. What does net zero mean to you? Right.
Exactly. And then how binding is that obligation going to be? And I think this is always a question of alignment and comfort. And it's almost like any internal task, like setting OKRs or goals or projections, where we have to get some comfort level that this is a reasonable expectation. We love proposing accountability. So putting things in a form where they're binding, I think is sometimes more helpful because you're accountable to your shareholders, to your stakeholders, and it helps because now there's the positive externality pushing you to bring those visions to life.
Yeah. So I like the two axes you talked about, abstract versus concrete on the one hand, right? And then aspirational versus binding on the other. I think those two axes are a great kind of place to start. And I totally agree with you that there's like a third axis that of accountability, right? So how accountable is your, irrespective of how this purpose is defined, talk about accountability because there's a whole thing about greenwashing now, right? Some organizations have made some measure of purpose or disclose some measure of purpose with respect to their practices, their green practices. And those are now being subject to scrutiny with respect to representations that have been made publicly to induce people to invest, for example. There can and maybe should be other forms of accountability, including self-accountability, right? How is the organization holding itself accountable through some form of corporate or organizational mechanism, right? Whether that's a board exercise or an officerial exercise or a stockholder exercise or donor exercise if it's a nonprofit, right? I think to the extent that purpose can be held accountable internally, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Building a purpose-driven organization and getting that right spot on the spectrum between sort of vague and concrete, aspirational, and really binding is an art of pulling together various tools from these different domains.
A couple examples that come to mind, actually. One example that really struck me and stuck with me was in 2020 when so many law firms came out with their Black Lives Matter pledge, right? And a lot of law firms publicly took the position that Black Lives Matter was important to them. And I'm talking about like the big firms, the huge firms, right? And that these were the steps they were going to take to talk about racial discrimination in the US and professionally within the legal profession. And they were never either held internally accountable or externally accountable for some of those pledges. There are some firms for whom that was a meaningful exercise and that really helped shift the narrative about racial injustice and racial discrimination in the legal profession. But I think for a lot of firms, it was a marketing exercise. And it's frankly just abhorrent that racial discrimination would be used in that way. But I think for me, that's an incredible example of how purpose can be twisted, right? Without accountability and the inauthenticity that we talked about earlier, right? And I think it would be a worthwhile exercise actually, because all that stuff was public, right? All that stuff was put on LinkedIn, all that stuff was press release and all the rest. I mean, I think it would be an incredibly worthwhile exercise for somebody to go back and look to see what all these firms were saying in 2020 and how many of those pledges were implemented. So, I mean, that's an example, I think, of how all these things we've talked about intersect currently. Another example that comes to mind are these net zero pledges and a lot of this greenwashing, which is rampant now. And again, it's kind of like a feel-good exercise for many organizations. But what are the meaningful, authentic steps that organizations are taking to actually limit global warming, there's a sense of which organizations are doing that authentically and which ones aren't. And there's also a sense of which organizations can be held accountable and which ones are escaping accountability. So Mark, what are some documents that clients or organizations, what are some documents that organizations could create in order to document their purpose and also be transparent about it with the public?
It's really important is to engage in an internal introspective process that is confidential to the organization. And just as a person wouldn't want to sort of think through what's your life's goal in public, because you may sort of take back moments later. To get it to have a process that empties all your ideational sort of basket and throws all your things down on the table and to say, okay, these are our creative notions about where we could go. And then to line that up with a general description of what it would mean to transition towards a purpose-driven organization, those components of how and where we would be going. And then kind of a description of the impact, the emotional, spiritual, the targeted and intended emotional, spiritual, interpersonal, organizational impact of moving towards this destination. And then I think list the actions, the ones that have been taken already. The first action is really coming up with this document.
Right.
And then the ones that are more proximate, the next steps, and the ones that are in the future. I think you could call this document a bunch of different things, but I think maybe the purpose-driven organizational charter.
I agree. I mean, I think the first step is to set an intention organizationally, which is to say, we are going to become this type of organization, and here are our values, and here's what the world looks like after we've converted into this type of organization and after we are engaged in our mission, engaged in our purpose. I think that it's like exactly what we've just all been talking about. It's answering in a paper document the how and the where in addition to the why. So, and what does the world look like? It's also answering the what in a lot of ways. Like, what does the world look like after we are engaged in this process? And is the world a better off place, or have we broken things as a result? I'm a big believer in like corporate or organizational manifestos. And I mean, that's a public facing document, for example, that can tell the world what your purpose is, right? It doesn't have to take the form of a manifesto, right? It could take the form of a credo or something else, or public values on the website. There is this B Corp certification that is around and that will analyze your practices internally, your internal labor practices, your corporate practices, and will certify you as meeting particular standards. And I think that gets you a lot of the way there. It doesn't necessarily answer the purpose question, which I think you still need to do on your own. But there are absolutely meaningful ways to talk about purpose and to paper that and to document that, and then also to add some form of accountability. So another thing is you could adopt one of these particular corporate forms that provide for some type of shareholder accountability through the courts. Accountability is an essential component of this. So I would say the first step for me is like putting it in writing organizationally and adopting organizationally a form of writing that answers the how and the where, and then also talks about accountability and how the organization will be held accountable to this writing.